Hello, this is Attorney Augustus Corbett, and I want to talk with you in this video about a very important lawsuit that was filed by Byron Allen. Byron Allen is the owner of Entertainment Studios Networks Incorporated, and he filed a lawsuit against McDonald's Corporation. Yes, I'm talking about McDonald's, Mickey D's, where many of us eat hamburgers and fries and ice cream and so on. Mr. Allen has filed a lawsuit against McDonald's, and we're going to get into that just a little bit. If you recall, a couple of years ago, I did another video where Mr. Allen sued under his company, Entertainment Studios Networks Incorporated. He sued Comcast and he sued Charter Communications. Both of these are television conglomerates, if you will. McDonald's Corporation is a completely different type of corporation, but Mr. Allen alleges pretty much the same type of action. He's alleging racial discrimination. And I want to talk to you about this complaint just for a little bit here. It's a very important lawsuit, extremely important. It's important not only for Mr. Allen, it's also important for us African Americans, as was the last lawsuit that he filed. This one also has national import for our community. I just really like the way that Mr. Allen is using his wealth, his status, his intelligence to push forward civil rights. I heard him talk about why he's doing so in a couple of interviews, and he attributes a lot of this to Coretta Scott King, the late Coretta Scott King, in the work that her husband did, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And he tells about a conversation that he had with Miss King, where she said that the struggle for justice is kind of in its last stage. She explained, according to Mr. Allen, that initially it was to get slavery abolished, to abolish slavery. And then, of course, it was to dismantle Jim Crow. And then in the 60s, it was about getting civil rights laws passed. We did every bit of that. Slavery was abolished, Jim Crow was dismantled legally, and civil rights bills were passed. The Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, the Voting Rights Act, and according to Mr. Allen, Miss Coretta Scott King said to him, the last and final stage is to get full equality in terms of economics. Economic equality is the last stage of this fight for us. And I completely agree. I totally agree. I heard Dr. King in a speech that he gave at Stanford University where he talked about two Americas. This was after the Civil Rights Act had been passed. This was after the Brown versus Board of Education case had been handed down. This was after the success of desegregating the Montgomery busing company there in Montgomery. It was after all of that. And so Dr. King was now focused on economics, economic equality for African Americans. And he had moved his family to Chicago, where they started Operation Breadbasket, which became Operation Push, which has been led by Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr. for the last 4 decades or more, 5 decades. So he had switched his attention from the civil rights struggle to the struggle for economic equality. And it's all civil rights, but this is sort of the next phase of the fight, okay? Dr. King, I heard him in a speech encourage some students somewhere in the Philadelphia area. he encouraged them to start walking in some of the opportunities that their parents didn't have. He was saying to them, your parents didn't have a lot of the opportunities that you have now because we have been able to dismantle segregation. We've been able to undo some of the injustices that African Americans have faced. So the opportunities are bounding, and he was encouraging those students to walk in those opportunities. I want to do the same, and that's exactly where I see us now. I think that it's time for us African Americans to begin to walk in some of the opportunities, or more of the opportunities that we have fought for minorities to have. You know, there are a lot of minorities who do everything they can to get to America, and those minorities come here and they take advantage of opportunities that we as African Americans have struggled and died and shed blood for, and oftentimes we don't benefit from them as much as we should. Well, I think that is where we are now. And as much as we see oppression, we have to also see opportunity. As much as we see racial oppression, we have to also see the opportunity to walk in some of those doors, but there's so much more, right? The election and re-election of Barack Obama showed us that we're gaining strength and power. The election of the first African-American vice president, African-American woman, is another sign that we are making serious progress. But I say it this way. Celebrate the progress, but continue the protests. Celebrate the progress, but continue the protests. And speaking of celebration, I am doing this video on June 19th, 2021, which is the day that we celebrate Juneteenth. In fact, Congress, the past day or so, I think it was either yesterday or the day before, enacted the Juneteenth holiday. And we are happy about that. We're very happy about that, although we know that there's still so much work that has to be done. In fact, the GOP voted to approve the Juneteenth holiday. However, the GOP is blocking all efforts to get a voters' bill passed, named in honor of the late Representative John Lewis, and the GOP is blocking legislation to address police brutality that is named in honor of George Floyd, the George Floyd Policing Injustice Act. So, yeah, thank you for the Juneteenth holiday, but that's not going to cause us to go to our corners and sit back and celebrate that and take our minds off the real fight. The real fight, again, is getting those bills passed. The real fight is addressing the wealth disparity in America. The real fight is addressing the educational disparities in America, the health disparities in America. We still have a lot of fighting to do. And again, that's why I celebrate the work that Byron Allen is doing through his company, Entertainment Studios Networks Incorporated. Now, of course, Mr. Allen is a businessman, and he's in business to make a profit. If he doesn't make a profit, he goes out of business. And all the people that he employs and all the things that he is doing, he can't do if he doesn't have the money, the resources, and the wealth to do them. So we know that there is a profit motive to some of what he's doing, but I do believe him when he says that he took seriously what Miss Coretta Scott King told him about pushing forward this thing of economic equality. And so he has been suing companies, and forcing those companies to recognize the economic rights that we African Americans have. Again, he has sued the Charter Corporation. He has sued Comcast. He has sued, I believe, General Motors. And now he has this suit against McDonald's. So what is this suit all about? Again, this suit is about racial discrimination. Mr. Allen alleges in his suit that McDonald's is violating the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was passed during Reconstruction, a year after slavery was abolished. 1 year after the country abolished slavery, Reconstruction Acts were passed, bills were passed, laws were passed. One of them, again, was the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and today it is codified in 42 USC section 1981 in the U.S. Code. Okay, again, 42 USC, which stands for United States Code, section 1981. He also sued under the California Unruh Civil Rights Act. Unruh, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he sued under a California statute as well. But what is of special attention or consideration in this particular video is the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Now, I want to read you what it says because it's extremely important, very important. All right, it says, the pertinent part of it says, all persons within the jurisdiction of the United States shall have the same right in every state and territory to make and enforce contracts, to sue, be parties, give evidence, and to the full and equal benefit of all laws and proceedings for the security of persons and property as is enjoyed by white citizens, and shall be subject to like punishment, pains, penalties, taxes, license, executions of every kind, and to no other. Now, I could stay right there on that section of 1866 and camp right there for a long time. I won't do so. I do want to highlight several things. All persons. All persons means all persons. It doesn't mean all white persons. It doesn't mean all Asian persons. It doesn't mean all Hispanic persons. It means all persons, irrespective of people's colors, within the jurisdiction of the United States. So wherever the United States government has jurisdiction, that would include all 50 states and territories. This section of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 said we shall all have the same right, not one set of rights for one race and another set of rights for another race, not one set of rights for one ethnicity and another one for another group of another ethnicity. No, we shall all have the same right in every state, not different rights in California, but other rights in North Carolina, but other rights in Oregon and other rights in Georgia and South Carolina. No, shall have the same right in every state and territory to make and enforce contracts. And that's where Mr. Allen has hinged his lawsuit on this issue of contracts. But I want you to see this. Contracts to sue, be parties, give evidence, watch this, and to the full and equal benefit, to the full and equal benefit. That's what we're still fighting for. Again, slavery has been abolished. We've dismantled Jim Crow. We got civil rights laws on the books, but we don't have full and equal benefit of all laws in America. That's what the last frontier is all about. And I believe that that will come about as we fight and struggle for economic equality at this point. Economic equality. We know that in America, whites have 8, 9, 10 or more times more wealth than black Americans. We know that 1/3 of African Americans have negative equity. 1/3, 33 and a third of all black Americans are underwater in terms of their net worth. We know that African Americans have twice as much unemployment. We know that African American, as whites, we know that African Americans have less wealth in terms of stocks and mutual funds and bonds and business ownership. We know when it comes to the economics, that is where we lag way behind. And we saw some of the consequences of that in this pandemic that just passed, right? Blacks and Hispanics died disproportionately during COVID-19 because blacks and Hispanics were essential workers without a lot of wealth and had to get out there and face COVID-19 even before the vaccines were released. And as a result, and some health issues as well, but it had also a lot to do with the fact that black Americans, Hispanic Americans are the essential workers having less wealth and having to get out there, whereas their white and Asian counterparts were able to work from home often because of the wealth, the disproportionate amount of wealth that they have. So I'm telling you, the last frontier for full and equal benefit under the law, to me, is this area of economic rights, economic equality. And Mr. Allen is right on point to be taking these corporations into court and forcing them to obey and comply with the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and all other equal protection laws, such as the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and to the Voting Rights Act, although they have gutted it and will likely gut it some more. There's a U.S. Supreme Court case that will be handed down very soon. And many people expect that the court is going to take another swipe, another bite out of the Voting Rights Act. So the fight is still on. We're in the last frontier, but it's still on. And we see all the voter disenfranchisement that's going on. We see all the hysteria related to critical race theory. We see all of that. We see the anti-protest laws that are being passed to shut us up in states around the country. We see all of that. We're fighting all of that, okay? And this fight here that Mr. Allen has with McDonald's is a huge fight. Now, let me talk to you a little bit about this lawsuit. Let me take a little water here. So Mr. Allen, in his lawsuit here, Mr. Allen owns TV networks, okay? This entertainment studio networks own a number of television networks. I'm trying to see if I can find them. They're all over our television. You may not even know that Mr. Allen owns these networks, but his company does. For example, Animal Planet, Cooking Channel, Comedy Central, Destination America, E, Food Network, Motor Trend, Travel Channel, and many others, this lawsuit says. And he recently purchased the Weather Channel, which is owned by the Weather Group, which is, Mr. Allen says, is considered to be the top cable network in television right now. So So Mr. Allen is no lightweight when it comes to business. And he feels, however, that he's being discriminated against by McDonald's because McDonald's does not spend a lot of advertising dollars with companies that are owned by African Americans. According to Mr. Allen's lawsuit here, McDonald's has sort of a multi-tiered advertising scheme where they spend a whole lot of money in one tier with white-owned television networks and companies and advertisers, but they spend a whole lot less money with black television companies and black ad agencies. And Mr. Allen, although his company is very successful, he is relegated to the small amount of dollars that McDonald's spends with just the black companies, corporations, TV stations, ad agencies, etc. He gives the number in here, if I can find it, and you'll see why he is up in arms about this, and he has a right to. So he says, for example, McDonald's spends over $1 billion per year advertising on content produced and distributed by media companies in the United States. And by the way, I'm quoting his lawsuit. In 2019, McDonald's spent approximately $1.6 billion advertising on television in the United States. Of that budget, of that $1.6 billion, McDonald's spent less than $5 million on African American owned media companies. $1.6 billion with a B. And out of that, they only spent $5 million on African American owned media companies, or with African American media companies. And he goes on to say, to put that into perspective, McDonald's paid its CEO twice as much as McDonald's spent with black advertisers, although Mr. Allen alleges in his lawsuit that African Americans make up 40% of the people who eat at McDonald's. 40% of the people who eat McDonald's are African Americans, yet they spend such a measly amount of money with a large, prosperous, well-known, black-owned media network. That is unfair. And Mr. Allen believes that that violates the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Now, I want to just pull some other things out of his lawsuit. So again, and I'm quoting, McDonald's has a different tier for African Americans. For the McDonald's African American advertising budget, which is de minimis compared to the general market budget, McDonald's contracts with a different advertising agent. McDonald's African American advertising agency is Burrell Communications. Burrell distributes African American RFPs to entertainment studios and other African American media companies. Now, why, one of the first questions you have to ask is, why does McDonald's have two different tiers, one for whites, one for white companies, and one for black companies? I mean, what is the point of that? I mean, why? Why is there, we just read where the Civil Rights Act of 1866 said there should be full and equal benefit. And it says all persons within the jurisdiction of the United States and all the states. Why does McDonald's have one huge advertising budget for white-owned companies and a measly amount, a small percentage of its advertising budget it spends with black companies? I mean, that just sounds to me to be bigoted and discriminatory on its face. I mean, just right on its face. And as a matter of fact, I think from what I read, shortly after Mr. Allen filed his lawsuit, McDonald's came out with a statement promising to increase its advertising budgets with African Americans. Well, and okay, but what took you so long? And how do we know you're going to follow through with that? And so this lawsuit will continue, I'm sure. I'm sure Mr. Allen will continue this lawsuit until something is, until a settlement is reached, or they litigate it or take it to trial or whatever. But it does just sound to be discriminatory on its face. It's the way it sounds. I don't know. I mean, it is. If what Mr. Allen is alleging in his lawsuit is accurate, it is discriminatory on its face. All right? So why is this important for us? Well, it's important for us for a number of reasons. I mean, when I say us, I'm talking about us consumers, us African-American consumers in particular. I am a small business owner. I'm an attorney. I have a law firm, have some other things out there. I occasionally will eat at McDonald's, but I don't want to eat at a place where I know is discriminating against a wealthy black-owned corporation like this. I don't want them taking my dollars and using it that way. I don't want to give them my money if they're not going to be fair toward people who look like me. I'm not going to do that. So, as a matter of fact, on a personal note, I've decided that I'm going to not eat at McDonald's while this lawsuit is pending. Okay? While this lawsuit is pending, and depending on the outcome of this lawsuit, I'm going to support Mr. Allen's efforts to get McDonald's to do the right thing by African Americans. All right? And you decide if you want to do that, but I think it's really important. The more that Mr. Allen grows as a businessman and the more his company grows, then the more he can invest back into the black community. So that's the thing we got to learn how to do. We got to learn how to recirculate our dollars in the black community. Just several weeks ago, we all commemorated the Tulsa race, not riot, I wouldn't even call it a riot, massacre, okay, where white citizens in Tulsa became angry over a lie about a black man assaulting a white woman, and they completely wiped out a very prosperous section of Tulsa, in fact, a prosperous section of the country, a prosperous black section of the country, and murdered over 300 people. Okay? And one of the things that I recall reading about Black Wall Street, as they call Tulsa, that section, I think it's the Greenwood section of Tulsa, was that black dollars circulated in that part of Tulsa 10 to 15 times. Nowadays, the average black dollar circulates in a black community once. Just once. We must begin to focus on economic parity and equality. That is where we are now. We've got to start focusing on building wealth, on reestablishing our economic base. When we integrated, we left a lot of our black-owned corporations and businesses. I remember growing up in the 70s and the 60s, there were all kinds of black-owned businesses. There were black-owned shoe shops, black-owned bookstores, black-owned beauty shops. Still, you got black-owned barber shops But back then you had black-owned banks, and still have a couple to this day. Black-owned hospitals, black-owned insurance companies, black-owned doctors, lawyers, black-owned grocery stores. We have none of that, or nearly none of that today. Not to mention all of the black farmers that I grew up around. We have virtually none of that today. And some of that can be pointed to or attributed to the discrimination that we still face, despite the abolishment of slavery, despite the dismantling of Jim Crow, despite the civil rights laws that we got passed. We're still dealing with a lot of discrimination. And Mr. Allen's lawsuit points that out. It brings that out. And so I stand with him, and I encourage all of you to stand with Mr. Allen and try and force this corporation and others to do right by black-owned businesses. Let's suppose, for example, that you were a small business owner and you wanted to do some business with McDonald's. Let's say you wanted to supply their straws or supply their plastic cups, or you wanted to wash all the windows at their McDonald's in a particular neighborhood, or you wanted to staff their restaurants. Whatever service you provide, you wanted to do it with McDonald's, and that would be a huge step up for your company. But they discriminate against black-owned companies, so therefore you can't even bid for the services that they need, because they have this behind-the-scenes discriminatory practice going on. Well, I'm not saying that is the case, but I'm saying imagine that was the case. Mr. Allen believes that's what's happening when it comes to advertising. But imagine that was the case and you were trying to get some business with them, and you need this McDonald's contract to grow. You need this McDonald's contract to get to the next level with your business. You need this McDonald's contract to hire 10, 15, 20 more people, 50 more people, put 50 more folks to work at your corporation. However, you can't get the contract with McDonald's because of your skin color. Not because you're not as good or better than a lot of the other corporations, but merely because of your race. That is the kind of stuff that we must fight, and fight vigorously, as Mr. Allen is doing. And that's why I stand with him. And that's why I encourage you also to stand with him. This lawsuit is very early. We don't know how it's going to turn out. I speculate that they will probably reach a settlement. I hope that settlement is favorable to Mr. Allen, and I hope that settlement is indirectly favorable for African Americans, period. Okay? But I wanted to just come and talk to you a little bit about this lawsuit. It's not a very complicated lawsuit. When he sued Comcast and Charter, I did some commentary on that. The underlying issue is the same. He alleged that Charter and Comcast violated the same statute, but there was some hang up about whether or not his pleadings were met constitutional muster, went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court said, well, you do have to plead in a certain way. I noticed in this particular lawsuit, Mr. Allen followed the instructions of the U.S. Supreme Court in how he wrote up this complaint. So I don't anticipate that being an issue here. So again, let's stand with this brother. Let's stand with him as he fight these corporations, because if we can open them up, if we can get them to do the right thing. I remember something else he said in his lawsuit. He mentioned that several former McDonald's executives are also suing McDonald's because of racial discrimination. Several black-owned franchisees are also suing McDonald's because of racial discrimination. I didn't know this. And I was just at McDonald's a couple weeks ago. I didn't know this. I didn't know that McDonald's was accused of being discriminatory like this. Well, I'm glad to know it because, again, now I will keep my dollars in my pocket or go to someone else who does not look at the color of our skin and allegedly treat us different than it does other races of people. Okay? So let's support this brother. That's my point. Let's support him. Let's stand with him. All right? All right. I hope you got something out of this. You can follow Mr. Allen, online. He's all over the place. I think he brought the grill. I think he owns that company now. But yeah, he's all over the place. He owns all those television networks. And so check him out if you're not already. Also, check out some of my other videos, subscribe, become a subscriber. Click the bell so that you will get notified every time we release a new video. We try to do it every week, but look, I'm so busy I can't do a video every week, but I try real hard. I feel that it's my obligation to keep you abreast of what's happening in the law as it relates to African Americans in particular. All right? So again, this is Attorney Augustus Corbett here in Dallas, Texas, of Corbett & Corbett LLP. Thank you for tuning in. You have a good one, and happy Juneteenth.